The greatest thinkers of humanity have tried in various ways to prove the existence of God. Today, we explain some of these arguments, not to persuade or dissuade, but to introduce. We leave out any criticisms, since that should be a separate video. Alright, let's begin. First, there's the argument from beauty. Richard Swinburne, professor of philosophy at Oxford, argues in favor of God using the existence of beauty in the world and the concept of probability. He points out that God has a reason to make the world beautiful, although some beauty or ugliness will be within the power of humans to determine or perhaps improve. Also, he postulates that there's no inherent reason for the world having the characteristics that we know it to have to turn out to be beautiful or ugly. He then argues that given the characteristics of the world as we know it, we can think about the probability of this world turning out to be beautiful rather than ugly. We can then think about the probability of this world turning out to be beautiful rather than ugly, given the same characteristics that we know it to have, but with a difference of having a God. According to Swinburne, the probability of ending up living in a beautiful world with a God should be greater than one without. And since we do find an abundance of beauty in the world, such as the fine-tuned movements of celestial objects and the beautiful music of Mozart, it's more likely we live in a beautiful world that, as it turns out, we share with God. It's worth noting that Swinburne doesn't outright conclude God exists because we see beauty in the world. It could very well be that we live in a beautiful world without a God. He merely points out that the more likely scenario is a beautiful world with a God. Second, the very popular teleological argument, also and more widely known as the intelligent design argument. This line of reasoning argues that the world is extremely complex and seems to have been designed by a rational designer. Therefore, one must conclude that it was in fact designed by a creator we like to call God. William Paley, English clergyman and philosopher, presented in his book Natural Theology an analogy to help this argument. He asks, if he hit his foot on a rock while walking through a barren field and was asked where the rock came from, he might answer, for anything I know to the contrary, it had lain there forever. But should he have found a watch and was asked the same question, he wouldn't give the same answer, because he knows that at some point in the past, a watchmaker must have made that watch, which later ended up in this dump. Paley's conclusion being, just as there is a watchmaker for every watch, there must also be a creator for the world we see around us. This analogy is known as the watchmaker analogy and is widely used to explain the intelligent design argument. Third, the 5 arguments by Thomas Aquinas, Catholic priest, philosopher, and theologian. The first of which is called the Unmoved Mover. Aquinas points out that there is motion in the world, and all things in motion is moving because it was set in motion by another. And since we cannot regress forever, it would mean that there must exist a mover who set the world in motion, who himself needs no push. This unmoved mover is of course God. The second and third arguments are variations of the unmoved mover argument. The second one stating that everything needs a cause, and since we cannot regress infinitely, there must be a first cause, itself uncaused, which is God. The third one states that since all things can exist or not exist, there must have been a time when nothing existed, and since things exist now, a being with necessary existence or God must exist. Now the fourth one by Aquinas, argument from degrees. It goes like this. All things in the world vary in degree, degrees of goodness, beauty, etc. For example, a well-drawn painting is more beautiful than a poorly drawn one. But in order to judge whether something is better or worse, we need a golden standard, like a painting drawn by Michelangelo, in order to know that a drawing by the creator of this channel sucks. And since we see and recognize varying degrees of goodness or beauty in the world, it must be that a perfect example of goodness and beauty exists. This perfect standard is God. The fifth one is the final ends. We see in the world unintelligent things that aim for certain goals or ends. For example, an acorn will always grow into an oak tree and never a dog. Since an acorn has no way of setting this course of action, it must be set by something else that is intelligent. This setter of goals is God. Fourth, the argument for morality. The more popular version of the argument is 1. All humans have a sense of what is right or wrong. 2. If God does not exist, humans would not know of this objective morality. 3. Therefore, God exists. But the more interesting version is from Immanuel Kant, philosopher and Enlightenment thinker. He argues that in order for us to reach the highest good, a state in which both moral virtue and happiness are maximized, we must act morally. But in order for us to act morally with the objective of reaching this goal, we must first believe that moral actions indeed lead to moral virtue and happiness, a pathway which, if God existed, would also exist. But there's no inherent reason or any empirical evidence for us to believe that this path from moral action to moral virtue and happiness even exists. Therefore, in order for us to act morally with the goal of reaching the highest good, we must believe in the existence of God. It's interesting to note that Kant isn't saying God exists or probably does exist. He's pointing out that in order for us to live a moral life, something we should strive for, we ought to believe in God. Finally, let's move on to the ontological argument. Saint Anselm, theologian and Benedictine monk, in an effort to prove the existence of God, asks that we visualize the greatest being we can think of, a being so supreme that nothing can be better or greater than it. But if this being we just thought of does not exist, we can in fact envision a being that is better, a being that has both the characteristics of the original being, plus the added attribute of existence. As a consequence, Saint Anselm concludes that this greatest being, a being we like to call God, must necessarily exist. It's interesting that unlike other arguments for God that incorporate some kind of observation about the world, this argument starts from pure thought alone and extracts out of it a startling conclusion. Another version of the ontological argument was proposed by French philosopher Rene Descartes. He first states that whatever is contained in a clear and distinct idea of a thing must be the basis of that thing. But a clear and distinct idea of an absolutely perfect being must also contain the idea of existence. And since we can in fact think of a clear and distinct idea of an absolutely perfect being, such a perfect being, a being we call God, must exist. British mathematician and philosopher Bertrand Russell, impressed with this argument, is said to have exclaimed, "Great God in boots, the ontological argument is sound," while walking along Trinity Lane with a tin of tobacco. He did later reject the ontological argument, but it's certainly one of the more interesting arguments on this list. There are of course many more arguments in favor of the existence of God that was not mentioned here, and if you think we left out an important one, let us know in the comment section below. Stick science. Thank you for watching. We plan to upload a video about some criticisms surrounding these arguments. So subscribe if you're interested, and don't forget to hit the like button if you enjoyed this video.